Brian May kept this secret for 30 years. Freddie's last recording was his goodbye to the world. November 21, 1991. Garden Lodge Recording Studio, London. Freddie Mercury could barely walk from his bedroom to the makeshift studio his bandmates had set up in his home. His body, ravaged by AIDS, had wasted away to almost nothing. His legendary voice, the four-octave instrument that had commanded stadiums, now struggled to sustain a single note. But when Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon arrived that morning, Freddie was already sitting at the microphone waiting. "I need to record one more thing," he told them quietly. The three men looked at each other, hearts breaking, knowing this might be the last time they would ever make music together. What Freddie recorded that day remained locked in Brian May's memory for 30 years, too painful to discuss, too sacred to share. Until 2021, when Brian finally revealed why that final session wasn't just a recording, it was Freddie's farewell to life itself, sung directly to the one thing he could never defeat. By November 1991, everyone close to Freddie Mercury knew the end was approaching. He had publicly announced his AIDS diagnosis on November 23rd, and less than 24 hours later, he was gone. But in the days leading up to that announcement, Freddie was still fighting to do the one thing that had defined his entire existence: create music. The disease had been cruel in its progression. Freddie Mercury, who had once leaped across stages and commanded the attention of hundreds of thousands with pure charisma and vocal power, now needed assistance to move from room to room. His weight had dropped dramatically. His energy came in brief, unpredictable bursts between long periods of exhaustion. But his mind remained sharp, and his artistic drive remained undiminished. Music wasn't just what Freddie did. It was who he was at the most fundamental level, and he wasn't ready to stop, even as his body was shutting down. Queen had been working on what would become their final album with Freddie, Made in Heaven, throughout 1991. The recording sessions had been sporadic, scheduled around Freddie's increasingly limited energy and capacity. The band had adapted their entire process to accommodate his condition, setting up equipment at Garden Lodge so Freddie wouldn't have to travel to a traditional studio. Brian May, Roger Taylor, and John Deacon had approached these sessions with a mixture of professional dedication and profound grief. They were watching their friend and creative partner fade before their eyes, knowing that every session might be the last, trying to capture whatever Freddie still had to give while respecting his dignity and managing their own overwhelming emotions. The dynamic had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. For 2 decades, Freddie had been the unquestioned leader in the studio, driving the creative process with his vision and perfectionism. Now, his bandmates found themselves in the unfamiliar position of trying to protect him, to conserve his energy, to make every moment count, while trying not to show how devastated they were by his deterioration. Mother Love was a song Freddie had written with Brian May. The lyrics, written before Freddie's diagnosis, had taken on an eerie prescience as his condition worsened. The song dealt with themes of longing, loss, and the fundamental human need for comfort, themes that resonated with painful intensity given what Freddie was experiencing. The track required significant vocal work. Unlike some of the other songs they'd been recording, which Freddie could approach in small sections, Mother Love demanded sustained vocal performance with emotional depth. It was ambitious under normal circumstances. Given Freddie's condition, it seemed almost impossible. On the morning of November 21st, Brian May received a phone call from Freddie's assistant. "Freddie wants to record today. He says he needs to finish Mother Love." Brian's heart sank. He'd been at Garden Lodge just 2 days earlier, and Freddie had been particularly weak, struggling with pain and exhaustion. The idea of recording seemed not just difficult but potentially dangerous to Freddie's fragile health. "Tell him we can wait," Brian said. "Tell him to rest. We have time." But they didn't have time, and everyone knew it. The call came back within minutes. "Freddie says if you don't come today, the song won't get finished. He's insisting." Brian called Roger and John. The 3 of them drove to Garden Lodge in heavy silence, each processing the reality of what this session likely meant. This wasn't just another recording day. This was probably goodbye. When they arrived, they found Freddie in the small studio area that had been set up in one of Garden Lodge's rooms. The space was intimate, filled with the professional recording equipment that seemed incongruous in a home setting, surrounded by the personal touches that made it clearly Freddie's space, his art, his furniture, his life. Freddie was sitting in a chair near the microphone, wearing comfortable clothes that hung loosely on his diminished frame. His face was gaunt, his legendary features sharp with illness, but his eyes were alert, focused, determined. "Thank you for coming, darlings," he said, his voice quiet but carrying that familiar warmth. "Let's make some magic." Brian set up his guitar. Roger moved to the electronic drums they'd been using to avoid the physical strain of a full kit. John checked the bass connections. All of them were fighting back tears, maintaining professional composure because that's what Freddie needed from them. The backing track was already recorded. Freddie just needed to lay down the vocals. But "just" was a misleading word when it came to what the song demanded. The vocal line was challenging, requiring range, power, and emotional vulnerability. Everything that Freddie had always delivered, but that now seemed beyond his physical capacity. They ran through the song once so Freddie could hear the arrangement and remember his intended approach. He sat with his eyes closed, listening, his fingers tapping slightly against his leg in time with the music, his face showing concentration. When the playback ended, Freddie opened his eyes. "I'm ready." What happened over the next several hours would haunt Brian May for 3 decades. Freddie approached the microphone with the same professionalism he'd always brought to recording sessions. He put on the headphones. He positioned himself carefully, conserving energy in every movement. He signaled that he was ready to begin. The first take was heartbreaking. Freddie's voice, which had once soared effortlessly through 4 octaves, struggled with notes that should have been comfortable. He could hear the limitation in his own performance, and it frustrated him. But he didn't stop. He pushed through the entire song, giving everything he had. "Again," he said when the take ended. They recorded another take, then another. Freddie was relentless with himself, demanding perfection even as his body was failing. Between takes, he would sit down, breathing heavily, gathering strength. Then he would stand up and do it again. Brian, Roger, and John watched through the control room glass. Their professional appreciation for Freddie's determination mixed with anguish at watching him push himself so hard. Several times, one of them suggested taking a break, stopping for the day, coming back when Freddie was stronger. "I need to finish this," Freddie would say. "Today, please." By the early afternoon, Freddie had recorded most of the vocal track. The performance was extraordinary, not technically perfect in the way his earlier work had been, but filled with an emotional rawness that perfection could never achieve. You could hear everything in his voice: the pain, the exhaustion, the defiance, the fear, and underneath it all, the pure love of music that had driven his entire life. But there was one final section left, the last verse and the climactic ending of the song. This section required more vocal power than anything that had come before. Freddie attempted it twice and couldn't sustain the notes the way he wanted. On the third attempt, he got halfway through the verse and stopped abruptly, pulling off the headphones. His bandmates watched as he sat down heavily in the chair, his chest heaving, his face showing the toll that the session was taking. Brian came into the recording room immediately. "Fred, that's enough. We have what we need. The rest can wait." Freddie looked up at him, and Brian saw tears in his friend's eyes, something he'd rarely seen in all their years together. "I can't finish it," Freddie said quietly. "I don't have it anymore, Brian. I can't reach those notes. I can't give you what the song needs." Brian knelt beside his friend's chair. "You've given us everything, more than enough. We'll work with what we have. It's beautiful, Fred. It's perfect." Freddie shook his head. "It's not finished. I wanted to finish it." There was a long silence. Roger and John had joined them in the recording room, all 3 bandmates surrounding Freddie, not as fellow musicians, but as friends watching someone they loved confront a limit he'd never faced before. "You finish it," Freddie said to Brian finally. "The last verse, the ending. You do it. Your voice, your guitar, make it yours." Brian was shaking his head before Freddie finished speaking. "I can't. This is your song, your vocal. It needs to be you." "It needs to be finished," Freddie corrected gently. "And I can't do it, but you can. Promise me you'll finish it. Promise me the song won't be incomplete. The four men sat in that small studio, the weight of what was happening pressing down on all of them. This wasn't just about finishing a song anymore. This was Freddie accepting that his voice, the instrument that had defined his identity, was failing him. This was him passing something forward to someone he trusted. "I promise," Brian whispered. Freddie managed a slight smile. "Good. Now help me up. I need to rest." They helped Freddie from the studio to his bedroom, where Jim Hutton was waiting to help him get comfortable. The recording session was over. The song was not finished, and everyone in that house knew it would never be finished in the way Freddie had intended. 3 days later, Freddie Mercury was gone. In the aftermath of Freddie's death, Queen faced the impossible task of completing Made in Heaven without him. The album was meant to be a gift from Freddie to his fans, containing his final vocal performances, his last creative expressions. But Mother Love remained incomplete, the final verse and climactic ending unrecorded. Brian May approached the task with profound reluctance. Freddie had asked him to finish the song, had made him promise. But the idea of adding his voice to Freddie's final recording felt almost sacrilegious. How could he sing what Freddie couldn't? How could his voice possibly fill the space that Freddie's should have occupied? For months, Brian avoided it. The rest of the album came together. Other tracks were completed, mixed, polished, but Mother Love sat unfinished, a gap in the album that reflected the larger gap in all their lives. Finally, as the album deadline approached, Brian forced himself to confront what needed to be done. He went into the studio alone, put on the headphones, and listened to Freddie's recorded vocals. The sound of his friend's voice, knowing these were among the last recordings Freddie ever made, broke something inside Brian that had been barely holding together. When it came time to record his own vocal for the missing section, Brian made a decision. He wouldn't try to match Freddie's style. He wouldn't attempt to make his voice sound like a continuation of what came before. Instead, he would sing it in his own voice, making it clear that this section was different, that something had changed, that someone else had to step in because Freddie couldn't be there. The guitar solo, he added, was a conversation with absence, not trying to replace Freddie, but acknowledging that replacement was impossible. When Made in Heaven was released in 1995, Mother Love became one of the most powerful tracks on the album precisely because of its incompleteness. You could hear Freddie's voice for most of the song, and then suddenly, Brian's voice took over. The shift was jarring, emotional, a sonic representation of loss and continuation. But Brian never talked publicly about the details of that final recording session. He never explained why the song was incomplete in that specific way. The story of November 21st, 1991, of Freddie pushing himself to his absolute limit, of his final acknowledgement that his voice had reached its end, of his request that Brian finish what he couldn't, remained private. For 30 years, Brian carried that memory alone. In interviews, he would speak generally about the Made in Heaven sessions, about Freddie's bravery and determination. But he never revealed the specific moment when Freddie said, "I can't finish it," never described watching his friend confront the failure of the instrument that had defined his entire existence. In 2021, during a deeply personal interview about grief and loss, Brian May finally opened up about that day. He was 74 years old, looking back across 3 decades of life without his friend, and he decided the story could finally be told. "People often ask about Mother Love and why my voice appears at the end," Brian said, his voice thick with emotion even after all those years. "The truth is, Freddie couldn't finish it. He tried. God, he tried so hard, but his body just wouldn't let him reach those final notes." Brian paused, gathering himself. "He looked at me and said, 'You finish it.' And I promised I would, but what I never told anyone until now is what he said after that. He said, 'This song isn't for the album, Brian. It's my goodbye. I'm singing to death itself, telling it I loved my life, I loved my music, and I'm not going gently.'" The interviewer sat in respectful silence as Brian continued. "For 30 years, I couldn't listen to that song. Every time it would come on, I'd have to leave the room, because I can hear everything in Freddie's voice, the fight, the fear, the defiance, the acceptance. And then I hear my own voice at the end, and I'm reminded that I'm still here, and he's not. The revelation added new layers of meaning to a song that fans had already recognized as emotionally powerful. Mother Love wasn't just a track on an album. It was Freddie Mercury's final artistic statement, his last defiant gesture against the disease that was killing him, his farewell to the music that had been his entire reason for living. And it was incomplete, not because of time constraints or production decisions, but because Freddie's body had finally imposed a limit that his will couldn't overcome. The incompleteness became the point. The moment when Brian's voice replaced Freddie's wasn't a flaw in the recording. It was the exact moment when death took over, when Freddie's contribution to the world ended and others had to carry forward what he couldn't finish. Today, Mother Love stands as one of Queen's most emotionally resonant recordings. Musicians and vocalists study Freddie's performance not for its technical perfection, but for its raw, emotional honesty. You can hear a man singing while dying, refusing to let death steal his voice before he'd said everything he needed to say. Brian May, now in his 70s, has made peace with the song and with his role in completing it. He understands that Freddie's request wasn't about filling a gap in a recording. It was about trust, about brotherhood, about knowing that even when he was gone, the music would continue. Freddie taught me that art doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful, Brian reflected. That sometimes the cracks, the limitations, the places where we can't quite reach what we're striving for, those are the most human parts, the parts that connect us to each other across time and circumstance. The last recording session on November 21st, 1991, wasn't just about finishing a song. It was about dignity in the face of limitation, about artistic defiance against physical decline, and about the profound bond between artists who understand that their work will outlive them. Freddie Mercury sang his farewell to the world with whatever voice he had left, and when that voice finally failed, he trusted someone he loved to carry the music forward. The incompleteness of Mother Love isn't a tragedy. It's a gift, a reminder that we all reach our limits, that we all face moments when we can't finish what we started, and that the greatest legacy isn't perfection, but the trust we place in others to continue what we began. 3 days after that final session, Freddie Mercury was gone, but the song remained, incomplete, imperfect, and more powerful because of what it couldn't be. A final testament from one of music's greatest voices, singing directly to the one thing none of us can defeat, refusing to go quietly, loving life and music until the very last note.